Hello everyone, and welcome to my public accountability meeting for North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service. I'm Commissioner Zoe and I will be chairing the meeting today. So turning to the agenda, so agenda item 1, the apologies, and that's just from Matt Walker today. Agenda item 2, minutes of the previous meeting and actions. As far as I'm aware, there are no actions, and that the minutes from the previous meeting are recorded and published on the OPFCC website, so they can be accessed there. So agenda item 3, we do have a question today, and that's from the Stray Ferret. Hello, Stray Ferret, very welcome. So can we have the question up, please, on the screen, and I'll read it out. So, in May, fire engine availability was classed as critical for 10% of the time that month. What is the PFCC's opinion on this matter, given the consultation on reviewing fire crew numbers in Harrogate and other parts of North Yorkshire? So I think it's important to understand why that was in May, that it was 10%, it was classed as critical. So I'll hand over to the fire service to answer that bit, and then it'll come back to me to finish off. So who am I turning to from the fire service to answer this?
It'd be myself. Yes. So if I could, first of all, to absolutely acknowledge, that being at that critical, what we call critical, is somewhere we want to improve from. Our optimum level is between 38 and 45 fire appliances. If we're at critical, we are at 32 or less fire appliances. So first of all, to acknowledge and to understand what that means. So there are a number of reasons why we're at that level during May. First of all, are the ongoing challenges that we face both locally and nationally with regards to on-call availability and recruitment and retention. And some of those things include people having their primary employment not directly where they live, so therefore people are travelling further to commute to workplaces and therefore unavailable during daytime in particular. What I must say is that our availability is actually very good on our on-call stations in the evening. Other things and seasonal factors, particularly for May, were around people taking holidays and leave, particularly after a long COVID period and starting to see the better weather, and also around some sickness, where people have come back together and we've experienced some slightly higher than normal sickness levels, and that's impacted on some of our drivers that drive fire appliances and fire engines, and also officers in charge. So again, that's had an unusual sort of peak in activity during that time, which has meant availability has reduced. What's important, if I may, Commissioner, is to sort of point to the things that we're doing about that. Obviously, there are all the things that we already have ongoing around trying to create business hubs at some of our fire stations, trying to be more flexible with our training activity to hold it on different nights and courses to be broken up into segmented stages to allow people to be released from their primary employment, and also some technological advances around smart technology with booking on and off duty and things like that to improve the existing experience of our staff. But ultimately, this links in with our RRM proposals or risk and resource model proposals. And one of those areas is around the changes to Scarborough and Harrogate. What we know is that those locations at the moment, we have a standard fire engine, as well as what we call a tactical response vehicle, which responds to some incidents, not all incidents. And what we're looking to do is to replace that during peak time. So if we recall, I talked about, we have good availability during the evening of our on-call, but as this was recognised, we do have challenges during the daytime. And that proposal helps address that with putting that second full type appliance into those two locations that will attend the full range of incidents in that case. So I hope that's gone some way to explaining a little bit about why we had that, particularly in May, and some of the things that we're doing to resolve it.
Okay, thanks very much, James. And I'd like just to echo that really. I mean, it is incredibly concerning. And that's why in the consultation for the risk and resource model, the fire service invests in the on-call model, and the service uses its best, uses its resources in the very best way for the future. Okay, right. So moving on, agenda item 4. So North Yorkshire Fire Rescue Service, the presentation, which is going to be James and Andy. Can I hand over to you, please?
Thank you, Commissioner. Andy, I'm quite happy for you to take the reins on this and deliver the presentation.
Thanks very much. So I'll just share the presentation that I have today with regards to fire standards. It should be just coming live to speak. So hopefully that's visible now. And I'm just going to go to presentation mode. Hopefully everybody can see that. Perhaps you'd let me know if you can't see that. So the aim for me this afternoon is to give an overview of the fire standards for North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service. I'm Andy Blades, Group Manager for Head of Assurance within North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service. And the Assurance Directorate is leading the fire standards for North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service. The presentation, what my aim and focus really today is what we're doing in service in North Yorkshire rather than the wider picture. But I thought it'd be useful as an opener to really just give some of the national position really and how the Fire and Rescue Service developing and implementing fire standards across the service as a whole. So organisation services had professional standards being developed in various guises and forms, and North Yorkshire formed a professional standards function at a period of time in the past, which has since become the Assurance Directorate within North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service. And it was recognised that that was sort of left fairly to the direction of each individual service with regards to those professional standards, although there were some central guidance. So the National Fire Chiefs Council has developed the Fire Standards Board, and with that a range of standards are in development or actually published at this time, 12 standards published at this time, which brings a consistency and continuity to the Fire and Rescue Service nationally around those standards to drive improvement and to lead the sector in terms of a clear pathway with regards to the professional standards that are expected, can be demonstrated and achieved by each of the respective fire and rescue services. And that is published online through the Central Programme Office of the National Fire Chiefs Council through the website at the top, the Fire Standards Organisation. So it's available for viewing for anybody should they wish to get further information on those standards. Each of the standards are then developed across the range of the functions within a respective fire and rescue service. So as you can see within this slide, that ranges across from strategic levels within the organisation, cultural elements, enabling, and again, that's National Fire Chiefs Council wording. Whilst we do have Enable North Yorkshire, particularly in North Yorkshire, it is a national term that's used, the enabling function, through to service delivery, which we're familiar with around prevention, protection, response and resilience. So the point being really is that those standards are applied across every aspect of North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, rather than perhaps being focused, as some people might expect, just around an emergency operational response environment. So it's driven and steered and directed by some of the compliance areas that we have as an organisation. So the Fire and Rescue Services Act, the national framework, indeed the Fire and Rescue Plan, will be some of the legal drivers and the mandatory duties, as it says on the left, the overarching aspects where we want to demonstrate compliance and have a standard that we can align to so that we have a good understanding where we are compliant or indeed where there are areas to improve. And so that moves across each of those 4 columns within the respective areas to how the standards are built, ultimately to put us in a place whereby we meet the expectations of the community, we provide the best, most effective, most efficient service to the community, and those standards are can be clearly demonstrated, evidence can be provided to support how we align with those standards, and the performance can be measured with regards to compliance with those fire and rescue services against the standards as well. The framework is intended to give a complete roadmap from the National Fire Chiefs Council and the Fire Standards Board. The aim is to avoid duplication and overlapping, which might result in conflicting guidance if it was developed in isolation, and it should be easy to navigate for all audiences. So all people within North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service should be able to access, understand and implement those fire standards within their respective area, but also cross-reference those with other areas of work so we understand how they all join and where the interdependencies are. And I'll talk about that as we go through the presentation. So for the fire standard development, which was done by the Fire Standards Board, which has been created as part of the Central Programme Office within the National Fire Chiefs Council, it's that board that have developed and own each of the fire standards. And as we move forward, there will be additional standards that become live and published and start to need recognition within a North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service. But they determine what that good looks like. And that's one of the key drivers as well from the national position, really, is to set a level, set a standard whereby all fire and rescue services are working towards what we recognise as being good, rather than it being left slightly more to individual services to determine what that might look like within their respective organisations. It's commissioned by the National Fire Chief Council with regards to the development work. The other key aspect really to pick out with regards to this slide is where the inspectorate check if service is achieving. So the aim is that Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services will also have a reference to the fire standards, much as they do around things such as the National Occupational Standards. They will look to see how well the Fire and Rescue Service has embedded those standards and how they are measuring and demonstrating compliance against those standards. And that's some of the interdependency that I mentioned before. It's really important for us in North Yorkshire that the work that we do to demonstrate compliance against the fire standards will help us achieve the judgment criteria that's within the inspectorate 3 pillars of efficiency, effectiveness and people. So if we are able to demonstrate compliance with the fire standard and indeed good practice, and our aim will be to be, rather than just achieving compliance, we want to improve wherever we possibly can, and that will lead into the inspectorate outcomes of achieving good or outstanding wherever possible with regards to the performance for the organisation. It is applicable at this time within England, rather than being right across any other devolved administrations, but certainly North Yorkshire form part of those fire standards that are currently published. And we also liaise and have support of the region from a North East region aspect. So we have a specific point of contact for the National Fire Chiefs Council for the North East region, which North Yorkshire form part of. And we interact with that lead on a regular basis to help us develop where we are at this current time with the fire standards. It's important really to recognise that the board seek to ensure that any standards presented for approval have been developed in line with agreed development processes, have undergone appropriate consultation with subject matter experts and relevant stakeholders, and undergone an independent quality assurance process. So North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service at this time have been part of all of the consultations that have taken place with the published fire standards to date. We have completed all of the consultation requests and fed in where we think we can contribute with regards to the development of each of those fire standards. And whilst that has been done at consultation pre to publishing the fire standards, it continues with regards to interaction with the Central Programme Office in order to be able to keep developing the fire standards as well. And that rescue service specifically, the governance arrangements that we have are also mapped around a fire standards board. So where the National Fire Chiefs Council has a fire standards board, in service we also have a fire standard board. And that is consists of the senior leadership team member leading the board. So that is the Director of Assurance chairs the Fire Standards Board. The tactical leadership team own the respective standards. So each of the leadership team will have a standard which is aligned to their specific function. So that's group managers or function heads within Enable will have the ownership of those respective standards. Each one of those standards is subject to an individual gap analysis following the implementation model that's available through the National Fire Chiefs Council. Each of those gap analysis then has an action plan, which then determines the course of action to be taken on the back of any gaps being identified. And it is peer reviewed by the National Fire Chiefs Council. When I say peer reviewed by the National Fire Chiefs Council, that's our liaison with the North East region lead. And then the network of services that we have available within that North East region gives us access to the opportunity to peer review where we're at. So rather than us being absolutely clear where our evidence we think is robust and demonstrates good practice and compliance with the standard, it's a very useful opportunity to have that peer reviewed prior to any external scrutiny, such as the inspectorate, who will capture compliance with the fire standards within inspection processes. So currently, the focus for the service with regards to that governance group is to focus on gap analysis. Each of the published standards has been subject to a gap analysis. And then at the point of those gap analysis being complete, the action plans will be developed. There are a number, 5 of the published standards which have been subject to action plans as well as gap analysis this stage, so we're making good progress with regard to that. But again, the direction from the Central Programme Office is to work in that way, that the gap analysis is the priority, moving on to action plans from that position. Within the governance arrangements, there'll be a quarterly meeting chaired by the Director of Assurance. At that meeting, there will be an exceptions report provided by each of the specific leads to identify the progress of the gap analysis, the gaps that are identified that are risk critical, and also the action plan that's put in place to address any of those gaps identified. From that meeting, then, there are interim updates to the tactical leadership team meeting group and also the senior leadership team meeting group as a part of the Assurance Directorate overview. So that information is shared within those forums. The fire standards will form a part of the operational assurance audit process. So to give that some detail, when we visit fire station locations to audit watch-based people to understand the compliance with regards to the internal policy and procedure within North Yorkshire, we will include and do include the fire standards as a part of that assurance process. And that really starts to help us meet some of that needs around the interdependencies of the fire standards. So we know that by achieving compliance with the fire standards, it will contribute and help us demonstrate good or outstanding practice against the judgment criteria for the inspectorate. Likewise, it helps us provide robust evidence to say that we are meeting our requirements around the Fire and Rescue Services Act, the National Framework, and indeed the Fire and Rescue Plan, as I mentioned at the start. So they aren't working in isolation. There's a cross-referencing across the groups to make sure that the evidence we can provide in one area supports good performance or service improvement in other areas also. The action plan for the inspectorate will also be cross-referenced against any of the published fire standards and vice versa. So where that evidence gathering takes place, it's aligned within its respective work stream and not independent. So at this time, within the governance arrangements in service, all the standards have a responsible lead appointed. As I said previously, the gap analysis is active for all of the published standards. Indeed, it is complete for prevention, protection, safeguarding, operational competence and operational preparedness, and other areas of work are being developed and in progress at this time. The Internal Fire Standards Board has met in June of this year, and that was attended by the National Fire Chief Council point of contact to give all those respective leads an overview of the standards to get to embed the continuity and consistency within service for all those respective leads, and to establish the terms of reference and the operating arrangements for the fire standards boards in service. The next meeting is September for the Fire Standards Board, and that will start to see the exception reporting process be delivered to the chair of the Fire Standards Board, which will then be shared to the principally the senior leadership team with regards to the exceptions where applicable. National Fire Chiefs Council briefings have been completed, and we start to look forward into 2023 later in the presentation about the opportunities that are available for the support available to the service. And as I said, the 12 fire standards that are now published have been accessed via all those specific leads. So
sorry, Andy, can I
sure,
just a few questions on your last slide, if you wouldn't mind just popping back to it. Just can I ask a little bit about that process that you've outlined? It's great to hear that there's some progress being made. How long would you expect the progress, the kind of process of undertaking the gap analysis and developing an action plan to take? Because obviously you say that you've developed 5 action plans now, which is good to hear. But these standards have been published since January last year, since May last year, sorry, and the latest one was published in January. So I just really want to understand the kind of timeline you're looking at around developing those action plans and being able to implement them, so that we can understand a bit more about your expectation in terms of completing them, because as we know, they're going to continue to be published as well. So if you could just set out a bit about the timeline that you're expecting.
Yeah, so I've got that point actually later on, so it'll get repeated. But in answer to your question, Tom, the aim is to have all of the 12 published standard gap analysis and action plans complete within the next 12 months. And it would be inaccurate to say that is then not a quick pace for a number of those areas. One of the things at the moment, which is a challenge, is there's a number of changing roles in some key areas of the organisation. So around the training environment, for example, we are just changing due to retirement that lead for that particular standard. So it's important that that person coming into that role will have the opportunity to review that gap analysis and confirm that action plan. And once we get those places confirmed, that direction of travel will be quite rapid really with regards to how we lift it. So the overarching time frame is within that 12-month period to have those complete, the gap analysis and the action plan, because the supporting evidence around it is absolutely key as well, to say how do we evidence where we've said that we've got compliance against that, as well as the action plan to say that how we start to improve in that gap analysis as well. See, James's hand's gone up, so he may want to add to that.
Yeah, I just think it's important to note that in the first instance, as soon as these standards arrive, there is analysis taken out with regards to, is there any what we class as critical areas that we need to focus on, because of course that would give an increased urgency and priority to that work, and we'd target resource to that accordingly. Again, some of these standards vary in size and the level of detail that's required with regards to the research that's in order to achieve some of the standards. So it's really just important to put to that context. The final part to that, which Andy will come on to, is again, we are increasing the resource with regards to the coordination of these fire standards, which I won't go any further, but again, it's another measure that should help see progress being made. But it's really to make that point at the very beginning. First of all, we contribute to each of the consultations before the standards come out. So as a service, we have had the opportunity to help shape those standards, so there should be no surprises when they arrive. And then when they do, this that planning activity takes place based on a prioritised basis.
The other thing I would just finish off with regards to the answers to that question is that some of the areas that we work in are quite straightforward with regards to being able to identify where the gaps might be or what the improvements are. And actually, we've got the evidence very clearly that we are compliant against that standard now. So in prevention and protection, sometimes the arrangements that we have in place are well embedded and we can demonstrate that compliance straight away. Within that completion of that work within those action plans, there's some other areas of service development which need to come through. So, for example, around the code of ethics, while we have embedded the code of ethics now across the organisation, and we've done training across all the middle manager cadre and the wider service through the middle manager cadre, that cultural evidence to be able to demonstrate good evidence around how well embedded that is and the service culture will take some time to come through in that process as well. So there is some parts which will need to be developed as we go forward, as well as just being here today available to us to put into that action plan.
Thank you. That's good to hear that there's that ongoing process of evaluation as well. I guess there's perhaps a different discussion to be had around the timeline, perhaps another time. But that's good to hear. Thank you. And just in terms of the board level that you've got there, you've talked there about kind of individual gap analysis and action plans and the responsible leads for those. Obviously, those will all feed up to the board. Is there an overarching assurance plan that you've got around the standards as a whole, as opposed to just the individual plans, or are you just looking at the kind of individual plans and the progress against those?
In terms of the presentation today, it's very much around those individual elements, those standards, how we are really implementing that at that board level. It will form part of the assurance framework with regards to the service approach to the whole assurance arrangements that we have, to make sure they are weaved in. And that, to use the term, that golden thread goes all the way through every level of the organisation, and fire standards are captured from the strategic position of the organisation all the way through to the day-to-day service delivery of organisational priorities. James?
Yeah, just to add to that, really, that the purpose of the board is to have that oversight, that wider service look at what's happening, obviously also to hold individual owners to account, but ultimately that board then feeds into the SLT and through the governance model as we so need it to, based on the level of risk attached to anything that may come out of there. So the board does have that oversight across the service, across all areas and all functions, and that feeds into SLT.
Thank you.
Andy, I'd like to ask a question actually from what you've just said, and it's about that golden thread and how do firefighters and staff understand their role in achieving the standards. You've talked about training. I wonder if you could just put a bit more meat on the bones there, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is an area where towards the end of the presentation, I'll come on to the strengths and the challenges. Certainly, we recognise that there's a need to really develop that understanding right across the workforce with regards to fire standards, and totally recognise and appreciate the timeline which you've explained. You're studying, going back next May. It seems like a long period of time from that starting to where we are now. But when we look at all the other priorities from the service perspective to deliver, this forms a part of it. So before now, the National the National Operational Guidance that's come into service with regards to embedding the underpinning knowledge and understanding of the service has been a real key focus. And we've seen that needing to go out and really be delivered on a one-to-one basis almost with people. So taking that learning, we know that we'll need to do that with fire standards as well. So where we want to be is where we have that gap analysis done, we have those action plans developed with those clear leads so that they can then design the delivery of that training. And one of the other elements is that we need to have those resources which we have appointed. I just got distracted because it's just come in the chat that you're getting interruptions with my voice. So I'll change my voice content. Bear with me.
It's not too bad, Andy.
Okay, that should be just back to for that. Okay. So I'll just drop back into the components then of the fire standard. And with each of the respective standards, we can see how it's been designed from the national point of view with regards to those desired outcomes being very clear. As I mentioned, the legal requirements, how we achieve that, what's required to achieve it, and the expected benefits, and then supporting guidance. The reason why I've put that on there, because it'll lead me on to a particular example. So with regards to the specific standard that I've picked out to talk about today, it's around the fire protection fire standard. So that standard, when we look at it in terms of developing service improvement, what was identified through the gap analysis within the protection standard is that the standard determines that there should be an equality impact assessment, should form part of any regulatory reform fire safety order risk assessment. So when we were doing audits previously, we identified that where an assessment will identify individuals within a premise, for example, and their needs, it isn't specific around their vulnerability, perhaps. So the fire safety would consider who had been identified at risk, but not necessarily how that assessment outcome had been achieved and was not necessarily clear. So through the gap analysis within the protection standard, we identified that we weren't able to do that. Now, there wasn't total clarity as well about how we should be implementing that as a service. So the business fire safety professionals within the organisation made contact with the Protection Policy and Reform Unit within NFCC. And that unit were the people that did the consultation and the development of the fire standard. So we were able to go direct to the authors of the standard and start to understand what their perspective was with regard to that particular area. And then once we got that understanding, the protection activity now includes a review of any equality impact assessment that a responsible person may develop. So if we go out to a business premises in the community and we look at the fire safety audit compliance, we look at the fire safety risk assessment, the team will look for the equality impact assessment, which starts to understand then how that equality impact assessment identifies somebody as an individual, what their particular needs are from a fire safety perspective, and how their needs have been met, particularly those with vulnerability. And so where an individual has a disability within a work environment, the equality impact assessment should start to understand what it is needed in terms of fire safety for that individual. And that now has been driven across the service within the business fire safety teams and within the crews that go out and inspect premises as part of their routine protection activity. So that's a real area of service improvement that's been delivered as a result of the fire standard implementation. So I'm just dropping back as well to make sure you can see me. I lost the teams part of it. So realising the benefits then with regards to each of the respective standards, when we look at like the protection one there, the other example I would give is around the prevention standard. So each of the standards has a benefit identified that should be determined by compliance with or alignment with a particular standard. So the one I've picked out here, when we look at the prevention standard, the benefits that can be realised around the improved safety, health and well-being of communities, leading to a reduction in incidents, injuries, serious injuries and fatalities. So where we look to realise the benefits that are available to us as a service, already we will collate data and provide information to help us understand, are we improving the safety of our community, the health and well-being of our community? But we now need to start to build the fire standard requirements of identifying the benefits within the data provision as we move forward and develop that data provision as well. So the other areas it talks about in here is the improved competency of that prevention workforce, the number of employees that actually deliver prevention, and the training of those employees and volunteers that are trained. So again, if we look at one of the proposals through the RRM, we know that we want to increase our prevention capability within the organisation, and we want to be able to evidence the skills, knowledge and understanding of that part of the workforce. And then if we can evidence that in terms of data, that will also help us evidence the benefits that is brought to the organisation. So it's part of the wider service development that's going on, but it will factor into the fire standard work that we do. And again, the improved evaluation to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of prevention activities. So by gathering the evidence and presenting the evidence against a particular standard, we will realise the benefits to the organisation through that process. So that's now starting to be embedded in the performance framework.
Andy, can you just, you said there that you were looking at building out the kind of evaluation process and the way in which you're developing the data and so on. In relation to that particular example that you gave around the prevention, you already collect data, you're saying that you're going to have to change. Could you give some examples of the ways in which you're looking to change the way that you're collecting data, or what new data you would need to collect in order to be able to evidence that, as opposed to what you already collect?
Yeah, so at the moment we have data available to us in quite a limited format with some of that content. So we look at the competency, for example, around our protection or prevention teams. We know that we skill our people with a particular level of competence to go out into the community to deliver protection activities. So that's their fire safety qualifications at level 3 or level 4, depending on what level they operate at. And that's recorded within some of the databases that we have in service. In a number of other areas of data provision for service, we've moved across to the BI-powered dashboard-based information, which makes it much more accessible, user-friendly and available on a much day-to-day basis. So it will be looking to develop those databases and provision the data in a much more live, timely information source, so it's available to everybody. So we'll be able to extract at any point that information in a quick turnaround, really robust way. We'll be able to say, this is the number of people that we have in North Yorkshire who deliver prevention activities. This is the number that are qualified to level 3 or level 4. And that competency is all in date for the next 2 years. And that will support us within the fire standards, compliance and alignment. It will support us in the inspectorate data submissions. It will support us through audit processes that we might have through the wider business, or indeed through public scrutiny, should we wish that information to be made available on request. We can provide that in a much more reliable and speedy method, really, to what's available to us to some of the databases currently.
Okay. And so that will be the equivalent then for looking at the public benefit in terms of reductions in incidents and.
Absolutely, yeah, and it would be fair to say, I think, that we look to always develop and improve that information that we have available to us. So those incident numbers, how do we refine that? How do we do the intelligence-led information that then drives our prevention activity and our protection activity to keep those numbers falling and improving the safety to the community?
Okay, thank you.
So. Moving on then to some of the implementation arrangements that we have for each of those particular standards. The one I've picked out with the slide here is the operational response implementation guide. The point being, you're probably very familiar as a group, but for the wider audience online, through the programme office, each of the respective leads, or indeed the staff, and this probably goes towards the question raised by the Commissioner with regards to our people right across the organisation and having an understanding. We have a range of information, sources of information that are available to people, easily accessible, that starts to underpin that knowledge and understanding of the service arrangements for the fire standards and what the fire standards mean and how they can be implemented. So you can see it's got the benefits, plan, do and embed phase to give consistency across the fire and rescue service sector, but also from North Yorkshire's point of view, we can start to share that information across the service so everybody gets that understanding. And one of the specifics really with regards to that within this content, it makes reference to the fact that by implementing the National Operational Guidance and National Operational Learning, it will underpin the operational response of fire standards. So by having those two areas that need to be evidenced, we can show alignment against the operational response standard. And again, what we've done as a development or an improvement piece of work for service is that we were actively engaged in national operational learning through the portals that are available on that national footprint. But now within service and through the Assurance Directorate, we have a national operational learning decision log. So we look at all national operational learning. We make a decision on whether it's applicable to North Yorkshire, how we will disseminate that information, what information will be disseminated, and our rationale for that decision to underpin what we've done with any aspect of national operational learning. And so again, the alignment with the standard we had evidence for by bringing in some of the improvements as part of that gap analysis. Without going to the action plan, there's some easy improvements to make. So now we have good, strong evidence which will be demonstrating alignment with the fire standard, but will also contribute to, for example, the effectiveness pillar within the inspectorate process that moves us towards good or outstanding wherever we possibly can.
Andy, can I ask a question on, do you get any peer reviews on any of the standards? You know, do you go to get that support from any of the services around us?
No, we haven't met with any of the external services at the moment on the specific standards. We are in liaison with the regional partners, so West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, South Yorkshire and Humberside, and we do that through our YORG, it's called. So it's the Yorkshire and Humber Operational Response Group. But really where we get the peer review at the moment is from our National Fire Chiefs Council nominated lead, the specific point of contact. So that person has come into service, and whilst we did have a workshop where each of the leads all came to meet with that point of contact, we did do one-to-one reviews of the standards at that point with the regional lead rather. So that peer review started. What we would, where we aim to be, is a much more structured or formal process with regard to peer review, where we will share our completion of our gap analysis and action plans with our peers and ask for that formal response, really. So we've got the evidence again to underpin that, yeah, we've got the confidence we are achieving where we want to be.
James, I think you want to come in.
It was really just to say it is absolutely our intention to peer review with a similar service that's similar to North Yorkshire again. So we're comparing the similar demographic and size of service, etc. Just to make sure that we are again benchmarked against somebody who is relevant to us here in North Yorkshire. So it's just really to add that point.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I just ask a question around what you're talking about there in terms of your staff and firefighters understanding their role in this? You mentioned there that there's these resources that they can access, and that they and earlier you used the word should in terms of their informing themselves around this. And I just wanted to, if there is that self-learning element to this in terms of some of the standards, because I note that you also talked about the extensive training that's been done around the Code of Ethics. If there is a self-learning element to some of these standards, what is the service doing to assure themselves that that self-learning is taking place, and that therefore firefighters and staff are understanding the standards and helping to ensure that the services can comply with them, please?
Yeah, so that's where that fits into the operational assurance audit process that we have at the moment. So whilst that is termed as operational assurance, really the focus of the title is that it goes on in a fire station based location. So all watches will be subject to an audit process, which is the local district station manager will audit a watch. That will be supplemented by a peer station manager doing an audit at an interval, and then that will be supplemented by the group manager assurance doing that on a 2-year basis, so that there's that 3-way review of the arrangements in place across all aspects of service delivery. So by building the fire standards into the audit process, we can reference those fire standards to say, what's the knowledge? So it could be direct questioning. What's the knowledge and understanding? Where do you access the information? How do you implement that on a day-to-day basis with regards to your activity? And then where do you see those benefits from the organisational perspective of having the recognition of those standards? So it's very much part of that audit process at the moment, and that's reportable because the audits have reportable outcomes. So we can demonstrate when, where and how we've done that audit process and what the outcomes were. And again, the trend analysis of where we need to develop if that is required with regards to that. But that's an area of opportunity really where we look to really embed that again through the bidder manager card rate on a regular basis, because they are our auditors on a regular basis as well.
Okay. And does that auditing, so the auditing, as you say, asks those questions so that it's reportable? Does the actual interrogation of that go any deeper in terms of actually understanding what their knowledge is and whether they've attained the right level of knowledge about these things, or is it just tell us whether you have read the information or not?
Yeah, so if I use the protection example that I gave with regards to that particular standard, so the expectation is that we would go into, so a watch-based person doing fire safety activity at level 3 would be a watch manager or a crew manager. So the expectation I would have within that audit process is we would talk around that audit process to a premises and that understanding of that equality impact assessment. So is that looked at? How do you evidence that you've done that? What does that involve? And then we can cross-reference that with the standard to say, is it aligned to the standard? Are we demonstrating compliance? And have you got the links between what we do from a protection point of view under the Fire and Rescue Services Act, and indeed, are you doing it from the fire standards aspect as well, so that we've got all pieces joined up and again, we've got that golden thread.
Okay, thank you.
So a couple more. Sorry, that's lost that PowerPoint. Let me drop back to that. So for some reason, that now has really thrown me in a spin. Yeah. So from a fire standard implementation point of view, our leads will follow through the stepped pathway, interpreting what that standard means. The gap analysis we've talked about, but it will be following the particular areas that we've identified across the implementation framework, developing an action plan, and then that's where we start to move forward with regards to that performance management. As I mentioned about the Power BI and data collection, how it will feed into our statutory requirements to provide information to the inspectorate or the Home Office returns that we do. And although we've not a direct request at the moment with regards to a fire standards annual report to the NFCC, it's something we're anticipating, so we'll collate that information to be available of the progression. And then the wider aspects of the stakeholder engagement and evaluation, review dates, and ongoing development through reflection of lessons learned. So the point being that there's a clear framework for each of the respective leads, which helps us embed the standards where we want them to be, and again provide that reporting mechanism in terms of governance to the senior leadership team.
And sorry, just that map across with the NFCC's implementation tool.
Yes, yeah, that is a lift from the regional guidance that we've got from our specific point of contact, and again that peer review of saying this is what we're looking to embed as a framework. Does that demonstrate good practice? And we've had good feedback on that.
Great, thank you.
Caroline, you wanted to come in?
Thanks, Zoe. I was just mindful, Andy, of what you put on the last slide there, and lessons learned being at the end of the project. Just mindful of what you said about the culture and just embedding, just making sure that there were sort of channels of learning throughout each step there. Appreciating for firefighter staff that they may have more efficient, effective ways of implementation, and obviously like wider learning from other services, that is always going to be a channel that can feature at each part and not just lessons learnt at the end.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. And I think my response would be that that's captured within the fire standards element. And again, It's really important as a service that we don't do these aspects of work independently. So, other areas of work such as any inspector action plan or service development per se will have a learning process within it in that cycle. I think the point taken is that we may look to see where that fits right across the framework rather than just being at the end. But certainly within the governance framework, those fire standard board meetings in service will include learning and development as part of the feedback with that review.
Right, thank you.
Thanks. So it keeps doing that, doesn't it? It really likes So the final slide is around our summary, really, with regards to strengths, opportunities, challenges and results. So the strengths where we are today is that the respective owners all have a good understanding of the fire standards because of the access that we've had and the meetings that we've set up with that regional lead and the direct contact with the National Fire Chiefs Council. We have very recently appointed a permanent watch manager role to the position of fire standards. Well, it will capture fire standards. The role is actually projects and service compliance at watch manager level, but that will have a specific fire standards role to implement. The gap analyses are all active for the published standards and subject to reporting at the September meeting. As I said, a number of those gap analyses are complete and move into action plan phase. But at that meeting, we'll get a good understanding of the actual progress for the organisation. In terms of opportunities, there's some virtual sessions being delivered nationally in the new year. So the National Fire Chiefs Council recognise that there's a lot of development work still going on from a national position for all services. So from April 2023, there's more virtual sessions available, and we will look to communicate that across the service. We have plenty of opportunity and time to do that. So that will be a really good opportunity for all members of the organisation to engage in those virtual sessions, easily accessible and getting a good understanding of the fire standards. The challenges that we currently have are around the awareness, knowledge and understanding of the fire standards. We know that can be improved. We recognise that, and that lends itself to that opportunity and what I've talked about with regards to the middle manager support for embedding fire standards. And in terms of results, as previously mentioned as well, within that next 12 months, the service expects to be able to provide evidence of compliance across all of the published fire standards and publish the progress of emerging standard compliance. So at the moment, within the intranet, within the Fire and Rescue Service in North Yorkshire, we have a fire standards portal within the assurance page, so people can access that. That will be live with regards to the progress and can be subject to scrutiny at any point. And we'll look to understand how we can share and publish that from a public perspective. So there's good understanding of how we are achieving against the fire standards that are published, and indeed consulting with or developing the ones that are emerging from National Fire Chiefs Council. And that's the summary with regards to the presentation. Tom?
Thanks, Andy. I'd really like just to, on that note, where do you think your gaps are at the moment? At a kind of high level assessment, where do you think your gaps are? Which standards do you think the service is going to, well, which standards do you think that the service has already complied with, is well on track? Where do you think the gaps are? Which ones do you think you're going to struggle to become compliant with in relatively straightforward terms? And what are the reasons for that in terms of we talked about resources a bit, which I know is being sorted out, but in terms of the compliance angle of what needs to be done to become compliant, where the challenges may be in becoming compliant with those ones you've identified.
Yeah, certainly. So we have strong evidence around our prevention, protection, safeguarding, operational competence and operational preparedness in terms of the gap analysis to date. So they are well, I just want to say complete, because they're not absolutely complete with regards to the gap analysis, but there's strong evidence in that gap analysis there now, and we're moving to action plan with those, because they are areas of service delivery which we've been doing for a long time, and I would hope that all the systems and the processes we have in place support good performance in those areas. So our gap analysis at the moment demonstrate that as well. So we've got some really good practice there. Things particularly around things like safeguarding with regards to our contact with partner agencies, the process that we have both during office hours, where our safeguarding officer is available, but then underpinned by things such as our duty tactical response during out of hours, so we can access safeguarding arrangements 24/7, put us in a good place with regards to that gap analysis as well. I think one of the ones where I would say there's real development to do is data management. So that's recently published. The consultation phase was out and it was published, I think, on the 8th of August. But again, we know there's areas to develop and improve alongside colleagues from the neighbour around our data management. So how we access the data, how reliable it is, how we share that data, and then how we transfer that to organisations that request it is definitely area to improve. That's recognised, and I think with regards to the development process for that, it's really important that the standard is an integral part of the commissioning that we do around data, in part of that development, to make sure that any data development we're doing anyway meets the requirements of the standard. And we have already started that process, for example, in our Firewatch software application that we use for people. That's been subject to a significant review. The development's been done around that, and that will realise some of the needs that we have around data management in that gap analysis process. I think the other one that I would just reference very quickly is around driver competencies and driver skills. Because of the challenges that we face in North Yorkshire, the driving qualification arrangements now are quite extended. So we're talking about a 2-week period in order to be able to drive response. That's challenging for our on-call workforce. We know that reflects a national position, but so we need to overcome some of the issues, the wider issues of that national position, to put us in a place to achieve the fire standard compliance.
Thank you. And just off that, there's a couple of good examples that you've given there where there might be some wider challenges, but in terms of the broader set of standards and the process that you've been going through, but in particular, I guess, in terms of those ones where you are seeing potential challenges, have you been in contact with HMI? Have you been in contact with other services to understand where best practice exists and how you can take that on board?
Certainly with other services at the moment, so that reference meant to the regional services that we have. We're in touch with the West, South, Humberside. We've obviously got very strong links all the time, but we have currently with West Yorkshire particularly. So there's a real good opportunity there to share some of that learning between those organisations. And that northeast region as well is allowing us to look at that, and I think it's appropriate that we are in a similar place to a number of those services and organisations. I wouldn't say that we are exceptional in terms of some of the gaps we have, and indeed we certainly have some good areas of performance ahead of others that people take note of with regards to some of the processes and procedures we have.
Okay, I'm going to bring Jonathan in, and then I'm going to close this item because we're a bit tight for time now. So, Jonathan.
No, thank you, Commissioner, and I am aware of the time. I'm sure James will reflect that. Tom, thanks for those questions. They're all appropriate questions considering the impact of what the standards are. I think strategically, it's just right that we acknowledge the resources we have in North Yorkshire within this. It's a small team within the assurance, and the team do an immense amount of work on behalf of the service and the public delivery of what they achieve with the capacity that they have. So I thank them for that. There's been a couple of points that Andy's mentioned there around the emergency response driving and data management, and they're probably two key elements that we need to reflect on. For us, a local aspect is, as Andy mentioned there, the impact on local businesses that we're asking firefighters to have extra time off. It's now doubled, and that of course plays into not only availability, but of course then our ability to recruit and retain staff within there, which is having an impact on us. So there are strategic impacts of these standards that are coming in there. We also need to acknowledge that because it's quite a small team, we don't necessarily have the dynamic nature to then access, if all standards are released in a quick fire period, to resource all of those. So we critically review those, we understand the public impact, and that's where we'll then provide appropriate resources and then resource the rest where we can across the organisation. And I think for myself, from a strategic perspective as well within this, the assurance that I seek from the department is that it isn't just a binary view of the assurance framework. When we consider these standards, I look then across the organisation to see improvements in welfare, improvements in health and safety, improvements in service delivery as a result of the standards being implemented. So we have that double loop learning going throughout the organisation. So the public receive a far better product as a result of the standards, but that's across service delivery. It isn't in one, key specific area. Thanks very much, Commissioner.
Thank you. Right, thanks very much, Andy. Really appreciate that presentation. Thank you very much. Right, so we'll move on to agenda item 5, and that's the performance update. And James, I believe you're going to be taking this forward.
Thanks, Commissioner. Okay, I'll just start the presentation. Okay, so we're looking at the reporting period of April to June this year. And if I move straight on to our incident overview, and what I'd like to really draw your attention is that left-hand side. The top graph there shows us that the trend has followed previous years, where we see as we come into those summer months, we do experience overall a gradual increase in incidents. But if I bring you down to the chart below that in the bottom left-hand corner, when we compare our incidents, our total number of incidents against previous years, we are up in both fires and in special services. And part of that can be attributed to the previous 2 years where businesses and people have been not been operating due to COVID, or people have been at home. But let's drill a little bit further into that in the next slide, looking at our top 10 incident types. So as you'll see on the graph on the left, in the orange section where it says 112, that is an increase of fires in the open. Now, as I'd already mentioned, part of that is seasonal, but also this year we have had an exceptionally long dry spell, and that has been building up. And as we know, that culminated in July. But that really started back in June, and that's reflected in there. The other thing, part of that plays into it, is obviously school children are beginning to play out, and often also can be involved in antisocial behaviour at times, and I can attribute to some of those incidents. As far as where those incidents have occurred, what I can say is there's been a significant increase in the Scarborough area, and that's been recognised by the crews and the prevention teams locally there, and they've worked with the hub in Scarborough to tackle some of these problem spots where people have been obviously using barbecues, where we've had antisocial behaviour, and action has taken place along with police colleagues to address that, and hopefully we will see a reduction in those areas as we go forward. Another area to draw your attention to is the false alarm apparatus, which we'll come on to in a bit more detail in a second. Again, seeing a small increase there, but what we have seen is a reduction in false alarm good intent. And what we are saying is that some of the education work that we've done with our crews and indeed with the public has meant that some of the reporting of those good intents have actually now been shown within false alarm apparatus. Again, I won't go too deeply into that because we'll touch on that in a moment. The other areas that are reoccurring that we see an increase in, that we mentioned on the first slide, is special services, and that's assisting other agencies, again with the ambulance service and other partners requesting access to be gained and providing additional support to them in order to help our communities in other ways is on the increase, and we recognise that and monitoring it closely. If I could move on then
Sorry, could I just jump in quickly on this fires in the open?
Yeah.
Could you just explain quickly or summarize the difference in your view between what a small fire in the open is and what would constitute a wildfire, just on a couple of fronts? A, for the public's sake, and secondly, just because looking at some of the logs recently, I have noticed that there's a wide variation in what is classified as a small fire in the open, and sometimes a whole field seems to be on fire, and sometimes it's just a small campfire which has been left or smouldering, or a bonfire which is being reported, and I just wanted to kind of get some clarification on why there might be that kind of variation on that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, unfortunately, Tom, it's been a while since I've completed our incident response recording system, sorry. So I can't give you the exact definition, but I will go some way to try. So there are definitions with our crews, so they have a consistent or should have a consistent sort of reference point to go to when they are recording these incident types. So when it's recorded as a small fire and when it's recorded as a wildfire. Ultimately, a wildfire is, as you rightly said, covering a much greater area than a small fire in the open, because that's exactly, I suppose, what it suggests. And that it's often protracted, a wildfire. Now, where that tipping point is, I say, I haven't got the definition in front of me right now, but normally what we'd expect to see as a small fire is things like rubbish bins or barbecues, people perhaps burning outside, where that's become started as under control and has spread, but has been confined within their property or within that locality. A wildfire is typically where it has ranged over out of control. So a key thing there is it's not under control and is spread over wide areas. So, you know, a number of hectares is how we normally would record a wildfire. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Okay, false alarms, automatic false alarms. Again, what really this graph is showing us, again, is echoing the point that I made earlier on, that there is a gradual increase, but we've tried to explain that some of that is seasonal. And I think the best thing to do is to go on to the next slide to sort of highlight that, really. And if you look at that bottom slide there, and we look at the months along the bottom in comparison with, well, going from 2020 to 2022, there's a quite not quite the same in 2020 due to probably lockdown and some of the COVID restrictions. But what you can see is definitely a pattern where they increase in the summer months. And what we'll say there is that we know that people's behaviours in the summer months slightly change, so they leave doors open in premises. So where there's dust, where work's being carried out, that will travel and often set off detectors. Also, the increase in insects is quite a common trigger. But what I will say is that what we have introduced with the new forms, which are giving us more accurate recording of the types of actuation at automatic fire alarms, we're going to be able to understand that better as we move on. So we already know, like I said, there's some of those triggers, and we already are proactive in trying to get that message across with owners around managing their systems effectively, obviously particularly coming into the summer months. But we hope to have better intelligence now as we move forward to help us really target those problem areas that we might not currently be aware of. But it's certainly a trend that is worth noting. I'll move on to the next slide. So I'm going to move on to appliance availability. And as was regarding the question was raised earlier in the presentation, was about that 10% in May. So I think we've already covered that. I'm not going to cover that same ground. But what you can say this month is that some of that has readjusted to what we would expect to see more commonly this time of year. Again, we've talked about all those measures that we are doing to again increase that level of availability. We did run a Safe to Ride course in August where we had 11 successful candidates. Some, unfortunately, due to injury and other circumstances, didn't complete the course, but 11 again is it will be an addition to what we've currently got on our fire stations. And we're running another course, which will be the autumn course, again, where we would hope to have a full course of recruits that would later obviously land on fire stations and add to that availability. And of course, that doesn't negate all the things that we are doing for our existing staff to retain them and ensure that they're having a positive experience with us. Things talked about earlier on around more flexible training, creating those business hubs, and again, that advancement in technology allowing smart devices to be used to book on and off duty. I'll briefly touch on this slide here. Obviously, we have some areas of specific concern, and again, really, we're looking specifically about how we can target those areas. What I would like to say and bring our attention to is those stations that have a tactical response vehicle that obviously, when is crewed with 4, is seen as a light rescue pump or a full fire appliance that's available for all incident types, isn't reflected in this graph. So that's both Summerbridge and Sherburn, in particular of note because of that lower availability, and that is exactly why those resources have been put there, to increase that level of availability, to ensure that they can respond, albeit to a less range of incidents.
James, could I just ask a question, please, about Huntington on call? I do notice, and I've looked back over the PAMs recent months, that it's actually gone down, their availability, just for last month. And I just wondered, did you know the reason why?
Yes. So obviously, we monitor all our fire stations and have a good understanding of availability there, and Huntington is of course one of no different. We have some sickness at Huntington. We also have various other things that I obviously won't go into today with regards to some personal matters. However, overall, what we're saying is Huntington is no different to our other on-call stations with regards to challenges of recruitment and retention. And what we are doing is making sure that we're doing everything that we can to support the staff there. And part of our proposal there through the RRM will be to have some dedicated staff that will support and supplement that on-call availability, but also to explore the various different ways and target specifically for Huntington how we can increase the numbers there. But what I can say is the reason it's dropped is for some sickness and a couple of other personal matters with individuals on that station at that time. But that doesn't negate the overall requirement to continue to increase the recruitment in that area.
Yeah, and I would just say that when I've looked back, that it is normally higher than that. And, you know, we look at Sherburn here as well, and actually it's higher than it was last month. So it fluctuates, doesn't it, up and down? But thank you for that, James.
It does. Thanks, Commissioner. And just if I could add one last final thing with that, it, again, part of this is seasonal, that we are obviously into that summer period, approaching that summer period with June, and sometimes that can have an influence as well.
James, can I just ask you, you mentioned there about being able to tell for those stations with an LRP that can be used as a TRV.
Yes.
what progress are you making towards being able to identify when it's available as a TRV as opposed to an LRP, and being able to present that, please, because we have been talking about that for quite a long time now.
Yes, yeah, absolutely acknowledge that, and we have some challenges with data, which we've already touched on today, and with regards to capacity around that. And that doesn't excuse it. So what I'll do is make sure that that is raised up the priority list when I leave today, Tom.
Thanks.
No problem.
Commissioner, could I just add on to that? Tom, that is part of the Firewatch upgrade as well. So when the software goes in there, that's also something when Vision, the mobilising system, and Firewatch are able to speak to each other intuitively through the system, we'll be able to withdraw that information. Thank you.
Okay.
That's a good point. Moving on then, just very briefly, we can see the orange line is our demand. The blue bars are our availability. So this really highlights again that our availability is inverted to our demand, and therefore what part of our RRM is to reduce that orange line down through prevention and protection activity. And again, as we'd already talked about with some of the proposals of particularly Harrogate and Scarborough, of increasing that resource with regards to the whole time, but also with retention and recruitment, increasing or certainly maintaining availability at those times elsewhere. So like I'm saying, the peak demand time is where we're looking to increase that at Harrogate and Scarborough. I'll move on then to the protection activity, if I could. So again, this is I see this as a positive news story with regards to both prevention and protection. With regards to, if you look at that bottom right-hand chart there, that is our proactive activity. So the regulatory activity, which is what we've otherwise known as the RRO, or Regulatory Reformed Fire Safety Order, is what both our crews and our specialist staff carry out proactively. And we know from already looking at the statistics throughout this presentation that we've had an increase in incidents, and we've had some sickness and various other things, but we have maintained a good level of activity there, which I feel is really positive. The other area, if you look at the top chart and the totals, again, they are mirrored based on where our resources are. So what I say is, as far as productivity goes, that is a good indicator for us with regards to that. On the top right-hand quartile, you can see that guidance and advice has slightly increased, which again we'd expect during summer months when people are running fates or putting up temporary structures for those type of events. We'd look to give that specialist advice, and again that's reflected in those figures this month. If we move on to the prevention activity, again a positive news story. Again, you look at those total numbers on that top chart, and again is proportionate to where we have resources, and that again gives us the indication that our crews and staff are being productive. Again, if we're looking at water safety and risk, so where we're making sure we're targeting the risk. If you look at Craven, we know we've got a risk there. We're doing something about that through the RRM and putting a resource there, but our proactive prevention activity is at its highest in that area. So again, real positive one there, and that's with a backdrop of maintaining good number of safe and well visits. And if you equate that is more than 7 a day across the service. That's 365 days a year, 7 days a week, and that's in the backdrop of doing training, the operational incidents, the protection work we talked about earlier on, maintaining equipment and all of the other things. So again, a real good indicator when we've had a period of high activity operationally. We've been maintaining that proactive prevention work. That's concludes the presentation, but happy to take any other questions that anybody might have.
I don't think there are any other questions, so thank you very much, James, for that. Very informative. Okay, so agenda item 8, questions from the public. I don't believe we have any further questions. Agenda item 9, any other business? I'd like to just hand over to Jonathan for this, please.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. It's a very quick AOB. Just to acknowledge Mr. Blades is off to a secondment to the HMI after some amazing service within North Yorkshire. So Andy, on behalf of the service and the members of the public, sincerely thank you for everything you've done for the service, your delivery, your manner and your professional deportment throughout everything you do. You'll be sorely missed when you go over there, and they will be absolutely having a great person in there. Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Appreciate that.
I'd like to echo that too, Andy. You've done a phenomenal amount of work for the service, so our thanks as well. And I'd like to just say again, thank you to all the staff, including the Force Control Room and the firefighters, whole time and on call. It's been an extremely busy time of late, and they'll be working extremely hard. So thank you very much for keeping our communities safe. Okay, so date of the next meeting is the 22nd of September. I'd like to thank everyone for watching and taking part as well. Keep those questions coming in for the September meeting. I really appreciate that. And it just leaves me to say, I hope you have a good afternoon, what's left of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.